Okay, so recording is started.
Okay. Right. Namaste and good evening to you all. As I said before we start this event will be recorded. Hindu Council of Birmingham are honoured to host tonight's event on hate crime. Tonight we have Chief Superintendent Mat Shaer. Have I got that right, Matt?
Certainly is.
Yep. Who will tell us about what is hate crime, define what hate crime is, and if you or your organisation are subjected to this ordeal, what type of help can you get? So further to do, I'll pass you over to Matt. Over to yourself, Matt.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the welcome. So I'll just give a little bit of context about myself. So my day job is as Commander in West Midlands Police for Birmingham East. And for policing purposes, the city is divided into two. But I also have force-wide responsibility for all offender management and for hate crime. So hence my reason for being here. I'm really delighted to be with you. So yes, I'm certainly going to go through some of the definitions of some of the key terminology with hate crime. I think that will be helpful to you. In particular, sort of three things that sometimes people get confused with: protected characteristics, hate incidents, and hate crime. I'm going to go through some of the really significant learning we've had in policing and in society, if I'm honest, in relation to hate crime. Some of the patterns and trends in hate crime, I think that will be useful to you. And clearly, some of the most important bit is, what have we been doing as West Midlands Police? What have we been doing with key partners to sort of try and get things better? Sorry, my computer just locked on me for a second. To get things better, what we've been doing with partners to make improvements, and what are some of the things that you as individuals or as part of organisations can look out for, and hopefully take some of these key messages back to your family, friends and communities. I think that's really important and powerful. I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes. I know I'm down for 40 minutes, but what I tend to find with these, because I've done a few of these before with various different communities, is that it tends to be the question and answers that people really do engage with and like. So please make a note of any questions. I'll take as many as I can, and I'll always try and give an open and honest answer to any questions, because when we talk about hate crime, when we talk about policing, as we know, that there can be some things that can be quite testy. I will always try and give an open and honest answer. So when I start these, I start with a quote. It's a quote from Nelson Mandela. It says, "No one is born hating another person because of the colour of his skin, or his background, or his religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite." I find that just such an important quote, and I really do believe it. I think he, as with many things that he did, he was absolutely spot on. When you listen to me and I talk about hate crime, a lot of it will sound negative because that's just the nature of some of the things that we have to deal with in policing. But I genuinely believe that it is not instinctive, it is not natural to hate. It is something that is taught and learnt, and therefore those behaviours can be unlearned. So I talk about 5 protected personal characteristics. Now, these are characteristics that are defined in legislation. And sometimes this is where people get confused when we talk about hate crime in the round, because they don't realise it just relates to certain characteristics, and therefore the question comes, what happens to those characteristics that sit outside by legislation? And I'll come on to those. So the 5 protected characteristics in legislation are disability, race, religion, transgender identity, and sexual orientation. So one of the things that you will find missing from there, perhaps, and some of the characteristics that perhaps you may have expected to find there are sort of age. We know that ageism exists. We know that lifestyle, certain people leading different lifestyles can be picked on, bullied, and worse because of the lifestyles. I'm thinking, for example, people who are goths live alternative lifestyles, and gender. There's been a massive coverage in the media, in politics, around misogyny, hatred directed at women. Those are, I will come on to how we deal with those, but those are actually not covered in specific hate crime legislation, which some people find unusual to hear. Now, what is a hate incident? So I will talk about two things: hate incidents and hate crime. So a hate incident is anything, and this is really important, anything where the victim or anyone else, and again, that's very important, think it was motivated by hostility or prejudice based on one of those 5 protected characteristics: disability, race, religion, transgender identity, or sexual orientation. Now, what that means for policing is, if anyone contacts us, and again, I stress anyone, because it doesn't just have to be the victim. It could be someone who witnesses something. It could be someone reporting on behalf of someone. This is really important, and it's an important message for communities. Then we must record it as such. We, the police, must record it. And anyone can be the victim. And this, for example, and I often use these type of examples, it doesn't have to be because of your own protected characteristics. So, for example, if someone is mistakenly identified as being transgender or lesbian or gay and is targeted for that reason, well, they are a victim of hate crime, even though they don't have that protected characteristic. Equally, if you have a disabled child and are a victim of a hate incident as a result of that, you can report that to police. So it doesn't have to be because you have the protected characteristic. Now, the where hate crime, hate incident, and hate crime differ is, in essence, for a hate crime to have occurred, there has to be something. There has to be an actual criminal offence to have taken place. So, hate incidents can be things like, littering. If you perceive that your driveway is being littered because of hostility or prejudice based on one of those 5 protected characteristics, well, that is a hate incident. You can report it to the police, but it doesn't make it a criminal offence, because there's no criminal offence specifically around littering. There are sort of local authority fines and things that can be done, but there's no specific criminal offence in relation to that. But any criminal offence can be a hate crime if it was carried out because of hostility or prejudice based on those 5 protected characteristics. So, for example, if someone is assaulted on the basis of one of those 5 protected characteristics: disability, race, religion, transgender identity, or sexual orientation, then a judge can impose a tougher sentence. So typically, if someone is convicted of an assault, they may get a particular sentence. But any crime like that, where there is a hate crime element to it, the judge has another piece of legislation called the Criminal Justice Act 2003, which means that they can impose a tougher, more severe sentence. Now, I spoke about some of those other characteristics that aren't covered in legislation. For example, age, lifestyle, gender. They're not covered in legislation, but what we have in policing is an agreement that we will record these. It doesn't mean we take action, but it does mean we record it. And you might sort of question, well, what's the point of doing that? Well, some of what's helpful to understand is, we are in constant conversation with the government around things like hate crime. It means that we can provide an evidential base if a particular group is being impacted. It also means that we can start to see the sort of tensions within communities and society if particular groups are being picked on. And that's very helpful to us in terms of how we allocate our resources. So some of the sort of real key learning points that have come out in hate crime. And there are particular cases that have typically led to this understanding. So the first one is, I think, a really pertinent one and something I hear a lot about. So sometimes you hear why, you ask people why they haven't reported hate crime or a hate incident, and it's often because they think, well, it's too minor, it's too trivial, the police have got better things to do, they won't take it seriously. Well, if any of you remember the case of Pilkington in Leicestershire a number of years ago, about 2007, what that showed is that on the surface, something that may appear minor can actually have an impact on the victim, which may be devastating or life-changing. The victims can suffer long-term vulnerability as a consequence of this sort of persistent targeting, and the accumulative impact should be considered by policing in its response. And what happened there was a sort of, it was in a rural setting, a mother with a severely disabled daughter, just constant being picked on and bullied, walking through her front garden, littering, and all of these in isolation. People were thinking, well, low level, not a lot, that can be done about it. But it was the accumulative impact of all of that, which was absolutely devastating on that family, and brought real lessons and learning and change in policing, and I hope in society. Then you've got the issue of, how hate crime really impact people, and sometimes this is just not understood. And it's one of my frustrations I see I feel when I see sort of hate crime being the impact of hate crime being minimized, particularly in some sections of the media. Because, I know people who have had to adapt their behavior to avoid victimization. So, for example, they won't go out into a particular area. They won't necessarily wear certain clothing that identifies them as being from a particular race or religion. They will prevent their children from going outside and playing. Well, these are some of the direct impacts of hate crime. And again, some really important learning that's come from us into policing over the years. And sort of finally, I'd sort of pick up on, some of the sort of real key cases that have just really emphasized to policing that if we get things wrong, the impact it can have on both society and communities, and on the trust and confidence that communities have in policing. So I'm thinking about particular cases like Stephen Lawrence, of course, in London. But even now, I would talk about global incidents, and I would reference the murder of George Floyd in America, and how that really resonated and had direct impact on the streets of the West Midlands here. So I would say Now, global events have started to fall into that category as well, and really demonstrated the importance of learning those sorts of lessons. So in terms of patterns and trends in hate crime, I'm probably going to just talk through two periods. I'm going to talk about pre-COVID, and I'm going to talk about since COVID and the pandemic has been in place. So pre-COVID, there were some really quite well established and understood patterns in hate crime, fairly predictable, if I'm honest. And I could name the particular triggers or events that when they took place, we would always typically know there would be a spike in hate crime. So every general election, we saw a spike in hate crime. When referendums are held, spike in hate crime. After some of the very significant UK-based and global terrorist incidents, there would be spikes in hate crime. International wars and conflicts would generate hate crime in this country. So you've got that global perspective that plays out locally, but then you also have local issues. So if I, as an example, I would say some of the protests that we had in Birmingham in relation to some of the schools programs, going back to 2019 now. Some of those protests, and I make no comment on the protests, but what I do know is that one of the things that we saw alongside that was a steep spike in reported hate crime from the LGBT communities. So you have that global perspective that impacts hate crime, and as well as the sort of local perspective. Apologies, I'm having to use my own phone for this, and I've got it propped up. So recorded hate crime in the years up to COVID was on the increase. That was sort of clearly established. We also had some fairly good evidence that more people were reporting it. So what I mean by that is one of the most important crime surveying methods in this country is the National Hate Crime Survey. That tends to be far more a far more accurate reflector of true crime rates than what gets typically reported into police, because we all know for a host of reasons some people don't report through to the police. But nevertheless, the National Hate Crime Survey has always been a good indicator of the true levels of reported hate crime. And what that has shown over time pre-COVID was that the level of hate crime being experienced by communities was in fact relatively stable, and in some instances reducing, while the reported levels coming into police was increasing. So if you can imagine that gap between the true crime figure and what gets reported into police over time was coming together, almost to the point where we were fairly confident that 1 in 2 of all hate crimes was typically being reported into police. We also knew at that point where hate crime was happening. So we knew about what I would term hotspots for hate crime. Now, typically, these were the city centres and town centres, and really strongly associated with the nighttime economy. And it's probably not surprising, therefore, that we also knew the type of individual that was mostly being impacted. So if you think about the nighttime economy, people out and about, so taxi drivers were being particularly impacted. students, particularly in Birmingham city centre, that they were a focus of hate crime. People who work security on the doors at nightclubs and pubs, they were attracting a lot of hate crime. So we had this sort of really relatively clear understanding. And in terms of the sort of biggest spike in that period, the biggest spike pre-COVID came really and truly after the Brexit referendum. So what we saw there was, you know, up to that point, a sort of an increase in the number being reported, but the jump after the Brexit referendum took us to a new norm, a new baseline, but at a higher level. And we stayed there sort of post that period. And that sort of took us in towards the sort of onset of COVID. And this is where things sort of took quite a dramatic turn. So at the start, what we saw were a number of issues that all came together. You could almost call them a perfect storm. And that's brought about what I would call a new norm, a new baseline, even higher than post-Brexit. So, so I'm going to talk through some of those things that sort of brought us to that point. Now, we're still in, you know, it's almost, you know, people forget it, but you know, as I found out today, because my wife was exposed to someone who's just tested positive, we are still in the middle of a pandemic, and so it, you know, it's going to be interesting how things progress, you know, over the coming months and you know, a year, 2 years. Will things change? Will things go back to a sort of pre-COVID level? I would really be interested in your thoughts on that, sort of in the question and answer session. I don't think it will. I think this new baseline that we're at, I think, is going to endure for a sustained period. But I would welcome your thoughts on it. So what happened at the start of COVID? So we started to see at the beginning, sort of February, March time, a real spike in hate crime directed at the Chinese and Southeast Asian communities. You know, cast your mind back, there was talk of it being called a Chinese virus. This was being sort of put out in the media. Don't forget, it was also being reinforced by some very prominent politicians. And this did lead to a significant spike. At that time, we worked really closely with the affected communities to reassure them of our response to it and to encourage them to report it. Some of the things that we did was getting information translated into their own languages, getting it covered in their own language and community media, and sort of talking and listening to the key community leaders. And the reason why I sort of use that as an example is, cast your mind back more recently to what is now universally referred to as the Delta variant. Do you remember what it was initially spoken of? It was called the Indian variant, the Indian COVID variant. One of the reasons why it was changed name to the Delta variant was because I and others in the community, I and others in policing and others that I work with in the community were making it really clear to government, amongst others, that using that term Indian variant was exceptionally unhelpful, and based on the evidence we had at the start of COVID, might in itself have generated hate crime. So it's one of the reasons that influenced that change by the World Health Organization to the Delta variant. So we do take learning and try and apply it. Then generally, as we entered the first lockdown, hate crime really dipped. the numbers being reported to us sort of fell off a cliff edge, if I'm honest, alongside many other crime types. The first lockdown was the most powerful crime reduction tool that certainly existed in my policing service over 28 years plus, because it was the most strictly applied. And of course, things like the nighttime economy. There was no nighttime economy, so it made sense that hate crime rates, just completely disappeared. And then what we had was, at the time of the easing of the first lockdown, a number of these issues that I sort of mentioned before all came together to contribute to what I have termed this new norm, this new baseline. So what are those things? Number one, the hate crime started to dramatically increase, and that's a national, not just within the West Midlands. Hate crime started to become a feature of neighbourhood disputes. So if you remember, I was saying before COVID, it was concentrated in the city centres and the town centres, and now it's moved to the neighbourhoods, to residential areas. And again, if you think about it logically, is that a surprise? Some of us can bear our neighbours, some of us can't, but those that can't probably have things like work and social life that, give us the respite from these neighbours that perhaps we don't get on with. Well, in COVID and during lockdown, that was taken away from us. We are having to live cheek by jowl with people. So probably not surprised that it started to feature within neighbourhood disputes. Security staff, particularly shop security staff, started to become a focus of hate crime. And again, if you cast your mind back, this is at a time where people going to shops, face masks were mandatory. The security staff were just trying to do their job and sort of remind people of this, and they became a focus of hate crime. Emergency workers also focus of hate crime, and I mean particularly those in the medical profession and those in policing. And again, if you think about it, there was two of the sort of most closely aligned blue light services that were engaged in sort of enforcing or responding to COVID. Then, and I've mentioned this before, we had the murder of George Floyd, which had a resounding impact across the world, including on the streets of West Midlands. And at the same time, this is where it becomes that sort of perfect storm. West Midlands Police itself, we embraced a new way of crime recording. And the whole purpose of that was to become much more compliant in recording every single type of crime that was being recorded. So you bring all of those together, and the net result is that since May 2000, we have progressed to this new baseline, whereby we are now seeing a monthly average of almost 1,000 hate crimes a month. And pre-COVID, we were at about 600. So represents an increase of something in the magnitude of 70%. So you can really see when I say, that the before COVID, post COVID is just a really different picture, because 70% increase in any crime type is not insignificant. Now, during the subsequent lockdown, so we had a further 2 lockdowns, as people know, we did see dips in reported levels, but don't forget, so while we had dips, don't forget now, we have now emerged into a situation whereby not only are we in that post-COVID environment, we have had all of those elements that I just spoke through come together. We now have the nighttime economy open in the city and town centres. We also have had the Euro finals, and people will know some of the hate that came out, particularly after the final. So this is the new norm where we presently sit. And I know that really does sound incredibly negative and, will probably alarm people. But so it's at that point, I think it's only right that I talk through some of the interventions that we have put in over years, but also more recently, just to show and reassure you that we take hate crime very seriously, that we do want people to report it, and that we do our best, our very level best, to respond to it properly. So at this, this event in itself is important, and I've been doing, I and other colleagues have been doing a number of events like this with different communities, because I think it's very important to raise awareness of hate crime and hopefully reassure people about just how seriously we take it. At the start of September this year, we rolled out the second year of training in the Stand By Me program. This is a hate crime intervention program brought over from America, some really good evaluation behind it. We were the very first force in the whole country to roll this out across the force area. We did it last year. They came back, delivered it this year, really successful. We, alongside working with the Police and Crime Commissioner, we now have a force-wide hate crime support provider for everyone who reports hate crime. So the organisation is called Remedy. They contact anyone who has reported hate crime within 24 hours. They will support them through the entire criminal justice process, or signpost them to other appropriate support services. That's a really important step forward. We were one of the first forces in the country to have a hate crime smartphone app. So what does it do? It answers all the main questions you may have, takes you through the steps of the criminal justice system, provides a multitude of different ways to report hate crime. So it gives you a link direct to West Midlands Police to report it online. That's great. But again, we realise that some people don't wish to do that. They perhaps might want to report it to the local authority, to a third-party reporting centre, to some of the national organisations that exist, who then pass the information on to us, but anonymised. We have also developed a very wide network of third-party reporting partners. So what does that mean? This can be anything from libraries to faith establishments, community centres, schools. There's a whole gambit of organisations and groups that we train. We go in, we train them up on hate crime legislation. We give them all the information they need, and what they can then do is take the information from people who have experienced hate crime and report it to us on their behalf. It's a really powerful service that some people really do like. As you would imagine, we work very closely with lots of our partners, including the Crown Prosecution Service. I think one of the most innovative and effective things we've been doing with them is to provide them with cases that haven't succeeded in getting a criminal outcome, a positive criminal outcome. And then it's effectively a sort of dip sampling process. And what we do is we work through those with them to find all the necessary learning where we can make improvements, or they can make improvements in their decision making. And that's a really good way of working together. One question I always get asked, and I'm keen to stress to people, is I will always try, as the hate crime lead, to advertise success in prosecuting people for hate crime. I think it sends out a powerful deterrent message. Some people say we don't do that enough, and the reason I sort of cover it now is because it's so important. No matter how well we try and publicise it, sometimes that sort of good news element just really isn't of interest to the media, and therefore doesn't often get picked up by them. But I promise you, we always try and advertise it. And finally, we're sort of working very closely with our local authority and other key partners to produce some really impactful local plans to improve community cohesion and to reassure at a local level that all the partners are working together to reduce hate crime. Now, there are lots more that I can talk through in terms of all that work that we have been doing, but I just wanted to give you that snapshot. And I think that sort of takes us up to about 30 minutes. That's how long I said I'd speak for. Hopefully you found that informative, but I'm really happy to take any questions. I don't know how you're going to run that, Jazz, but however it's done, I'll happily take any question.
I think we'll just do it as if somebody wants to either put their hands up or just if it's quiet, then just jump in. That should be fine, to be honest. If I'll start off with a question, Matt, and it's a bit of a devil's advocate one. When people do report hate crime and the officers fail to log it as hate crime, but they tell the third party or the injured party that, yeah, we've logged it and nothing gets done because of stats or statistics, how they want to play it with the police force. That has happened, so I'm fully aware of it. What's the procedures and what do we do? And okay. Why is it not being logged when somebody says it's a hate crime? Because I'm sure the definition is if any person perceives it to be.
Yes, so I'm confident that the vast majority of hate crime that is reported to us is properly captured and recorded. The reason I'm confident of that is because I've put in place over the last couple of years several layers of scrutiny. So, as an example, every neighbourhood policing unit across West Midlands, there's 8 in total, has a partnership team. What they do is on a 24-hour basis, they look at every hate crime to make sure, number one, it's been properly recorded. Because as you can imagine, there's different hate crime types. So they make sure it's been properly recorded. They make sure it's been, that all the initial correct actions have been taken. And then they make sure if there's anything sort of out of the ordinary, high profile, that gets raised to the attention of the local leadership team. So that's one of the elements I've put in place. Secondly, each of the protected characteristics that I spoke about has its own independent advisory group made up of people from the respective communities. They come together and they also dip sample crimes from within that protected characteristic to make sure that the police have done what they should have done and dealt with it in the appropriate manner. So there are some other things I can talk through that I've put in place, but what I've tried to do is like a sort of onion, try to build in over the last 2 years, just scrutiny check after scrutiny check after scrutiny check, just to make sure that we miss as few as possible and that all of those that do get reported are properly dealt with. Now, can I sit here and say 100% of the time we always get it right? No, but that's my ambition, and I'm constantly with my team working towards that.
Okay, so from the people on board, if they wanted to look at this data, what's been logged in, what do they need to do, and how do they get access to that statistics or what's happened?
Sorry, Jazz, what particular type of statistics?
So on the hate crime statistics, in the sense of if they live in a certain area, can they go by postcode or can they go by to the local police station? We need the stats of how much hate crime was reported, how was it dealt with, was it actioned correctly, and did it lead to a prosecution? Because the concern for most of the people in Birmingham or West Midlands is at one stage the temples were getting attacked. You know, the statues were getting broken into. I think there was some in Warsaw as well, which just outside it was broken. Some of the police act very proactively, and some of them really don't care. You've been to the temple, and you've seen that we've been broken into 25 times in 2 years, and there was only one person. That's somebody that ourselves had to actually physically grab and hold down until the police got there.
Yes, so each neighbourhood team will have a certain level of access to that sort of data. What they'll typically have access to is reported rates within their area. They would also be able to have access to the outcome rate. So what I mean by that is, the positive criminal justice outcome rate. They might even be able to break it down into protected characteristics. So yes, your neighbourhood teams should have that. Well, they should have access to that. They can have access to that. But what I do know is that on a month basis, each of those neighbourhood teams have what we call a tasking and performance meeting, where all of that data is gone through. And that's typically exposed to the local independent advisory group members who act as the sort of community scrutiny panels. So what I would encourage is, if people are interested, sort of to make contact, to look at, see whether there's an opportunity to become part of those sort of local independent advisory groups.
Okay, so we should be able to get information from the local advisory groups for the station, sorry.
Yes, don't forget, all of this information, it would have to go through the sort of freedom of information process, but all hate crime gets published nationally on an annual basis. So certainly, although it doesn't break it down into sort of particular areas, that is all readily available on the internet. All of our data is accessible. Some of it's accessible sort of immediately online through the sort of national work. Others, it's by through the sort of freedom of information route.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Anybody else?
Matt, can I just explore the point about having the scrutiny in place?
Yep.
To sort of validate that the hate crimes that have been reported have been dealt with appropriately. Okay.
Yes.
But on the flip side, and this is going back to the point that Jazz made, which I don't think you answered the question, to be honest, is that how can we confirm that the hate crime that is reported has been reported as a hate crime, because it is a hate crime? Because there's been many instances where that has not been the case, and it's been left to the individual officer possibly to determine whether they feel it's a hate crime or not. So
yeah,
we turn around and say it's a hate crime because it's happened on a numerous occasion, yeah, but it doesn't get recorded as that. So where's the scrutiny on that?
Right. So the scrutiny on that is, well, there's lots of scrutiny on that. So first of all, the sort of main routes into reporting hate crime are either using the online live chat system or through sort of contacting the police by telephone. Those individuals who, that's our forced contact department, they do regular dip sampling of all incidents that are reported. So to make sure that people have been recording it correctly. So for example, on top of that, we also get inspected by Her Majesty's Inspectorate for Constabularies, HMIC FRS. They come in and inspect whether we are recording stuff correctly. I can tell you they've been in recently. The report will be coming out relatively soon, and we are achieving very high accurate rates of crime recording. On top of that, as I said, the local partnership teams, they inspect all the crimes over the last 24 hours and look to identify anything that has been sort of misrecorded. What we don't, I want to offer some reassurance. I am very confident that if people report hate crime, I'm very confident if people report hate crime, it will be recorded. Sometimes what does happen is we flag it under a particular characteristic. So we might record it under, say, a race hate crime. But what it is, in essence, is it's both race and religiously aggravated. So that's something that we're trying to improve, to make sure that all the necessary flags are properly recorded. But what I am very confident on is that at the very outset, it does get recorded as a hate crime. And what we are trying to improve over time is that all the appropriate flags are recorded correctly. So, for example, you might be, someone who's gay and happens to be black, and you've been picked on for both reasons, but how we've recorded it just shows the gay mark, the LGBT marker, and we've forgotten to record the race marker. That's where we're looking to improve. But I'm really confident at the outset we do record it accurately.
Thanks, Matt.
Is it Tarang who wants to go next? And then we've got Lakshmi, and then we've got Kiran.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Jazz. Matt, good to see you. Matt, hi. The question, I think it's what Mir and Jazz and I have. The concern is that, and this is going back on a sort of an incident that happened at Ramadan in Birmingham, is where it was reported as a hate crime. The police officer felt that it wasn't, but the president did insist that it was a hate crime, and he was given an incident number. But once you've got this incident number, how can we check that it has been recorded correctly as a hate crime? How would we, as a person reporting the crime, know that it has been reported correctly? What feedback do we get?
Well, so if an officer disputes at the outset that they think it's hate crime, that's immaterial, and that is made very clear in the training. So when I spoke about it at the very start, the sort of various definitions of hate incident, hate crime, how and why we must record things, that is the training that's provided to both our force contact staff and our police officers. So they should know that irrespective of what they might believe, it should be recorded as a hate crime. It doesn't mean ultimately that the matter is perhaps prosecuted as a hate crime. That is for the investigation to determine and for the CPS to make a decision on. But the recording of it shouldn't be an issue. So if you have doubts because you're from an officer or from a member of staff that is being reported to you, all I would say is once you have the crime reference number, ask them to confirm that a hate crime flag has been recorded. And if it's an investigator that's been assigned to it, ask them the same thing. And if you're not happy with the response you've got from them, ask to speak to their supervisors and ask them the same question. Can I confirm that a hate crime flag has been recorded against this crime?
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
Lakshmi?
Hi, thank you. Thanks for the information that you've given so far. I want to speak about, there's two incidents. I'm from Mandir Baba Balaknath in Warsaw on Caldmore Road. So this is pre-COVID. there's a problem between Jammu and Kashmir, something that was happening obviously abroad. But there used to be a coach that used to leave for protest, and the time and the location they chose was during a service, a day of service that we would have been having for the past 37, 38 years, which was a Tuesday evening. And of course, the community that was attending the temple at that time, yes, they did feel threatened. They did feel scared, and that reduced the amount of people coming to the temple itself. I mean, it didn't only lasted as long as the whole protest lasted, but is that a hate crime? I don't know how this, I don't know how it was gone, how things were taken at that time. I mean, obviously, looking back at it now, I would have reported that as hate crime.
So this is where I come back to my two definitions. Was there a criminal offence that occurred? Just from what you've said, and clearly we won't have time to go into it, but no, not a crime has taken place, therefore not a hate crime. But as I come back to that definition, if you perceive something as a hate incident, then you have the right to report it as such. Mm-hmm. We will record it as a hate incident. But I then stress, it doesn't mean that we take action, or it doesn't mean that there's going to be a successful prosecution at the end of it, because for there to be a successful prosecution, there has to be a crime in legislation to have taken place. So your perception was these people turned up at this time because of prejudice or hostility towards your religion.
Yeah.
That is a hate incident.
Yeah.
We would record it as such, but there's a difference between hate incident and then it tipping over into a criminal offence, which is perpetrated on the basis of prejudice or hostility based on religion in this instance. Yeah. I hope that makes. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, that makes perfect. That makes clear. That all makes sense. So after this event happened, we have an annual event, which again we've been having for the past 37, 38 years, for which we do involve the police because we're on a main road. We need help with traffic. It's only for about 45 minutes that we're outside, or the congregation is outside. During this event, we have up to about 2,000 to 2,500 people in and out attending throughout the day. I wouldn't say that many people are outside at that one time, but this event we begin planning about 6 months in advance. So if it's in March, we'd start planning the end of this year. Yeah. But we had an email from the police a night before the event to say we can't turn up tomorrow. Now, is that hate crime?
What, the police can't turn up?
Yeah. I mean, if we can't look out to our authority to help us out in an event like this, which they've been doing for a long time anyway, but obviously because it happened after that series of events.
So I'd come back to, I mean, I could give my personal view on it, but that's irrespective. It comes down to how you have perceived it. If you think the police action is based on hostility or prejudice based on religion, as it would be in this case, then you can report it as such.
Yeah.
You know, I could probably give you an explanation as to the fact that those sorts of events have to go through a SAG process with the local authority and police. It would be risk assessed on the basis of all elements in terms of security, road traffic compliance, safety of the crowd, all of that side of things. This is all completely different aside from hate crime.
Yeah.
And then a sort of plan drawn up as to whether it requires police presence, or sometimes it's what we call passing attention. So it doesn't require a police presence, but passing attention would be advantageous. And perhaps something on the day or the day before comes in and says, unfortunately, we're just not going to be able to provide resources to it. So I can try and give a rational explanation, but it's almost irrelevant, because ultimately it's your perception of that action, and that's the thing that's important.
I think from what she was trying to say is I think she was more let down by the police because of the previous instance, and on the day or the night before.
Yeah.
What would be the protocols on that, Matt, to say, like, if she feels that it's been let down, possibly it's not a hate crime, but it's more like a community liaison thing,
Yes.
where the police has not acted professionally. I think that's what she's trying to say.
Yeah,
Well,
no,
yeah.
I get it, and this is what I was trying to say. The two things are slightly different, but nevertheless, people can perceive police action as you know, as I said, it comes down to perception. But this is where sort of local engagement comes in. The sort of policing partnership team is a really key thing to link in to sort of develop those relationships, so that so that hopefully people don't get let down. But at the very least, if there is going to be a letdown for whatever reason, and I would always err on the side of assuming it's for operational reasons, then at the very least you get a proper explanation, as opposed to just we're not turning up. Because in my eyes, that is just not acceptable. You know, sometimes for good operational reasons we can't supply officers, and I completely understand that. But at the very least, I would expect a proper explanation going into whoever's been affected by it.
So that should be fine. Hopefully that answers your question on that one.
That does, yes.
Anything,
Thank you very much.
you can also just pop into the local station, speak to the OQ commander or the supervisor, and I'm sure they'll be able to give a better definition. Sanjay Patel.
Thank you, Judge.
Yes, hello. I'm from Warsaw, and up the road from Lakshmiji's temple on Plek. Thank you, Matt. Very insightful. There's two points to make here. The first point is provocation. I would see a lot of people actually provoking the community, whereupon an incident hasn't taken place and possibly won't be written as a hate crime, but it's used to intimidate. And the second point is, when we have Navratri, which is a 9-day festival, we do get a lot of provocation outside, where people do turn up, do park up, and drug dealing will actually happen. And it's not just bad for resilient communities to actually try and tackle this crime, because that is an actual crime, because it intimidates and it deters people from attending such events. So on that sort of incidents that take place, you would think the local PCSO or the local police will be more vigilant, rather than leaving it up to the individual temples or organizations or institutions to actually make the call to call out for help. So I can sympathize with Lakshmiji and understand that a particular community will actually provoke. And that's what it is. It is intimidation. So what do you say about things like that, where the obvious statement is being made, which is, yeah, we feel hard done by, and there's not much we can do because we can report it, but the incident doesn't carry high enough profile merit because the KPI indicators aren't ticked?
I don't, I mean, I wouldn't agree with it's about KPIs. I would always say that we evaluate things on the basis of risk and threat. I think sometimes what does get lost in translation, funnily enough, I was having some conversations today about this. Sometimes what I think gets lost in translation in something getting reported to us is we don't necessarily fully understand what it feels like for that impacted community. So I go back to that Pilkington case, and as I said, that was instrumental in helping us to learn that antisocial behaviour. So when I first joined, policing, antisocial behaviour was something that no police officer did anything criminally about. You know, we might go and speak to people and move them on or something, but we never did anything about it. But we actually understand, as a result of that Pilkington case, how low-level stuff, what seemingly on the face of it is low-level stuff, can have that dramatic impact on individuals or indeed groups and communities. And I think if there's one thing that I would, seek to give guidance on, is if you're contacting the police to report that stuff, try to be as descriptive as you possibly can about all the surrounding impact. So, for example, this is a religious holiday. We have a lot of people from across the communities coming, across a wide range of age groups. Some of them are walking, and some of them are coming by car. What we have is some groups who are committing antisocial behaviour or drug dealing or whatever it is. We believe they are using this religious festival as a means to both intimidate us as a community and to further their criminal enterprise. And I would like to think that that would strike a much better chord with my colleagues when it comes to that risk and threat analysis.
I think just to lead on from there, sorry, if I can ask a secondary lead-up question, it definitely tightens the cord, but we do have a situation which is becoming more and more prevalent now, where on our religious festivals, we've actually had people on the PLEC organisation where people from other faiths actually sneak in, and all of a sudden it's an incident. Now, would you class that as misbehaviour, a misnomer? Or would you actually say that is a form of hate crime because it is an incident?
So it certainly is an incident. As I said, the hate incident aspect is your perception. I can't apply my perception to it. If your perception is people have come into your religious building on a festival day and they are there not to join in, not to observe, out of curiosity, but to intimidate or whatever it is, then you have the right to report it and it will be recorded as a hate incident.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I'm just going to ask one quick question before Kieran jumps in. What if, as a person at a temple or whatever the situation is, let's say if it's Sunday's place, they don't think it's a hate crime, but the police officer think it's a hate crime. Will that still be classed as a hate crime? Because obviously the police officer has a lot more experience and a lot more depth in understanding what the situation is. So where do you stand on that?
Yeah, Jazz, that's a really good question. And yes, it would be, because what we will try and do as part of our training is to train officers to ask the necessary questions that may elicit an explanation for why something has occurred. And if as part of that, the officer thinks, no, I think there is a clear hate motive as part of this, they can flag that and do flag that.
Okay, fine. Kiran Patel?
Thank you. Evening all. I just wanted to use the platform that I do to sort of, as I do, try and build bridges between West Midlands Police and the community. So rather than a question, I wanted to give a bit more context and reassurance from a grassroots level based on the first couple of questions, just to sort of give viewers that reassurance. Reports are screened through crime service team, which the police have, and they have to follow Home Office counting rules. The logs and crime reports are also dip sampled on a regular and daily basis based on the information reported. So those logs will be screened, and so will crime reports, to make sure that crimes and logs are dealt with correctly. So again, making sure that crimes are reported correctly based on the information that is reported. And of course, supervisors then will also review crime reports too. So I just wanted to give that bit of reassurance. And on a second note, just linking back to what Sanjay ji said of Navratri. So when I first joined West Midlands Police, what I started doing is, because of the array of mandirs which are across and spread across the West Midlands, I emailed out to all the senior leaders of those neighbourhood policing units to make sure that the local neighbourhood teams were aware of Navratri, what it means, the purpose behind it, and of course that it attracts large crowds who, of course, wear loads of expensive jewellery, clothes, and are potential victims to other crimes as well, which may or may not go reported. So I think it's important that we as a community and leaders of the mandirs also maybe link in with their local neighbourhood teams, just so they're aware, because sometimes those neighbourhood teams may not be aware of these festivals, especially that they are dealing with and working with different community groups. So I think it's always important that we also have that strong relationship with our local neighbourhood teams. I mean, I sort of see it in Leicester, where, because there's a large Hindu population, the local officers will actually attend the mandirs during Navratri and other festivals like Diwali, etc. So I think it's also, one, it gives our guests and attendees, congregates, that reassurance, but also we also have that policing presence and a strong relationship with our local police force and local police officers too. So it was just those 2 points which I just wanted to share based on sort of my views and experiences.
Okay, excellent. Just thank you, Kieran. Has anybody any other questions? No. Okay. Shall we put it? Okay, so I just want to thank you first of all, Matt, for your time today. I know I think you were meant to be somewhere else. I think you were last time we were saying, but thanks for putting the time out. I think this discussion on hate crime is very, very important. A lot of us from the ethnic background are unaware what the definition was and where we stand on reporting it. So thank you again on that, Matt, to kind of let us know what it means and where do we stand. Going forth, I know Matt does chair and is in charge of the hate crime, and he does, we used to do weekly meetings, but it's gone down to monthly ones. We'll extend the invite out to other organizations as well, if you don't mind, Matt, if they could join on those events. So he does lead on that one. Any issues that we do get as communities, we do need to address it through certain channels. I'm sure Matt's pointed out. We will be putting that on our website as well. Facebook, is Facebook Live now, Vips, and YouTube?
This recording will go on YouTube, so and Facebook as well.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, so we'll be putting out those links on the Facebook and on YouTube as well. So hopefully that gets through. Sorry, Paul, did you want to say something? Did you?
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name's Pal Deman. I'm from Birmingham City Council Victims and Vulnerabilities team from the Birmingham Safety Community Partnership team. And just to let you guys know that we are obviously now running a hate crime champions within Birmingham City Council for those people who are Birmingham City Council tenants. Obviously now these are housing officers who are specialists in hate crime reporting, and they will look at hate crime and to see what groups we can link in with, because we obviously link in with things like the football hate crime, other teams, other groups that do report it, because we sometimes find that certainly tenants from Birmingham City Council may not want to approach the police or may disclose something to us. So we will look at taking that forward, and our powers as well, as we can obviously get civil injunctions against neighbours as well. So from that point of view, we are doing a lot of work in there as well. So just to let you guys know that as well.
Cheers, Bill. Thanks. So again, a big thank you, Matt, for your time and pointing out. Hopefully this is one of many to start building up the grassroots from the minority background with the police force, because we know that the trust at the moment is very, very low due to several incidents that have happened, but hopefully we can start building upon it. Going forth, I think next week, 18th, who's got the date for the next event, H? It is to do with if you get the date from me, well, I'll explain. It is to do with the Police and Police Complaints Authority. if we unfortunately are not satisfied with the way West Midlands Police deal with anything, there is a complaints method that we can exercise to see if the police have acted in the correct way. If they have not, what options are available to us, and the police complaints authority can kind of enforce, I believe, Matt, if that's correct, certain things to be done, or guide you to take certain actions which have not.
They can direct us, yeah.
Yeah, so on that one, so that'll be the next event. So please stay in touch for that. Pal, I think it's definitely important to get you on board on getting this information out, because you probably have more information.
Yeah.
The police on these situations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Jazz, the event that you just mentioned there is on the 28th of October.
Yeah, what was the person's name? Sorry, who's the main guy? Do you know his name? Okay, it's on the 23rd of October at 8 p.m. till 9 p.m. We will be sending out the invites. Please do spread the word. The more the information that we get out to the community, the better it is, the better ties we have, and it's better for overall the community that we live in. So, Matt, do you want to say anything else before we close?
No, just thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Cheers, thank you. Till next time, everybody, take care of yourself.
Take care.
Thank you,
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
Thank you.